The morning we buried my father, 3 of Clell Mercer's men were already sitting their horses at the edge of our wash, waiting for us to finish so they could begin taking the place apart. I was 9 years old. I remember the cold more than the grief, because the grief was too big to hold in a boy's hands, and the cold I could feel in my fingers. My mother had dug most of the grave herself the day before, out under the cottonwood where the stony wash bent around our hill, because there was no one in Vesper Crossing willing to come out to Coyote Bend and lend a shovel with Mercer's name hanging over the place like weather. She had let me throw the first handful of dirt. Then she had taken the spade from old Prout, the only neighbor who dared come, and finished it with her own arms, and she had not cried, not where the men on the ridge could see. That was my mother, Marin Cole. I have lived a long life since, and I have known strong people, but I have never again known anyone who could stand so straight with so much weight set on her. The man at the front of those 3 riders was Lyle Sard, Mercer's foreman, a long-jawed man who smiled the way a knife smiles. He let us say our words over my father. He waited until Prout had shaken my mother's hand and ridden off, until it was just her and me and a mounded scar of earth under the cottonwood. Then he walked his horse down the slope into our dooryard, easy as a man coming for supper. "Sorry for your trouble, Miss Cole," he said, and tipped his hat and did not mean a word of it. "Hard thing burying a husband, harder still the rest of it." "Say what you came to say," my mother told him. He drew a folded paper from inside his coat and held it up so the wind could worry the corners. "Note your Daniel signed. $1,100 against the homestead due last spring carried over on Mr. Mercer's good nature. That good nature's run dry. Mr. Mercer will forgive the whole sum in exchange for the deed. Generous. You and the boy walk away clean, no debt following you." He smiled the knife smile. "You got till the end of the month. After that it ain't an offer, it's a fact." I did not understand notes and deeds then. I understood that this man wanted us gone, and that my father was in the ground, and that my mother's hand had found my shoulder and was gripping it hard enough to hurt. I have thought, in all the years since, that she held my shoulder that morning not to steady me, but to keep her own hand from shaking where Lyle Sard could see it. "Daniel never borrowed $1,100 in his life," she said. "He never borrowed $1 he didn't pay back." "Paper says different." Sard tucked it away. "Paper always wins, ma'am, end of the month." He turned his horse, and then he paused and looked at the spring where it came up clear and cold out of the rocks below the house, the one reliable water for 10 miles in any direction, the reason my father had broken his back 20 years to hold this ground, the reason Clell Mercer wanted it. "Pretty little spring," Sard said. "Shame to see it go to waste on a woman and a child." Then they rode out, the 3 of them, unhurried, the way men ride when they believe a place is already theirs. My mother stood a long while after the dust settled. The wind came down off the burnt ladder hills and pulled at her black dress and the loose hair at her neck. I asked her, in the small voice of a frightened boy, if we were going to have to leave. She looked at the cottonwood, at the new grave, at the spring, at the broken stretch of fence Mercer's men had cut 3 times that autumn so our few cattle would scatter and starve us out slow. She looked at all of it the way you look at a face you love and are about to lose. "No," she said, "this is ours, your father's in this ground, we don't leave him." I believed her because I was 9 and she was my mother. But that night, through the wall, I heard her at the table with my father's ledger and a guttering candle, and I heard the sound a strong person makes when they are sure no one can hear, a low, broken, exhausted sound, like a hinge giving way. She added the same column of figures over and over. There was no $1,100 anywhere in it. There was barely enough to feed us through the winter. But there was no debt either, none that my father had ever written down, and my mother knew her husband's hand and his honesty the way she knew her own heartbeat, and the not knowing was eating her alive. That is where things stood at Coyote Bend. The evening Gideon Vance rode in out of the west with the sun behind him. I saw him first. I was at the spring filling the water bucket, putting off the walk back up to a house full of grief, when a horse came down the wash trail at a walk, a rangy buckskin, trail-worn, and a man on it who looked as though he had been riding so long he'd half forgotten how to stop. He was lean and weathered and gray coming in at the temples, dressed in a duster gone the color of dust itself, a rifle in the scabbard and a bedroll behind the cantle and not much else. He had a quiet face. That is the thing I remember. Not hard, not soft, quiet, like a house with the shutters drawn. He reined in a respectful distance off and touched his hat brim to me. "Evening, son. That spring runs sweet." "Yes, sir," I said. "Mind if I water my horse? I'll not trouble your folks." I told him he could, and he stepped down stiff and let the buckskin drink, and he scooped a palmful for himself and drank, and closed his eyes a moment like a man tasting the first good thing in a long while. By then my mother had come out onto the porch with my father's shotgun broke open over her arm, not pointed, just present, the way a careful woman makes a point. "We've nothing to spare, mister," she called down. "If you're one of Mercer's, you can water and go." The man looked up the hill at her. Something passed over that quiet face. I didn't have a name for it then, but I have one now. It was recognition. Not of her, of the situation. The widow on the porch, the gun she didn't want to use, the fresh grave under the cottonwood, the cut fence, the look of a place under siege. He had seen it before, somewhere, the way you can tell a man has seen a thing before by how little it surprises him. "I don't know any Mercer, ma'am," he said. "I'm just passing. But I'll trade you honest work for a night in your barn and a meal if you've got work and can spare the meal. I won't take charity and I won't take what isn't offered." My mother studied him a long moment. Charity was a word that had teeth for her just then. Half the valley had offered it that autumn out of pity and the other half had withheld it out of fear of Mercer, and both had stung her pride the same. But work for keep, that was a bargain between equals, and I think she heard that he'd chosen the words on purpose. "There's a pump in the corral that's been fouled," she said. "Dead something dropped down the well shaft. I haven't the stomach or the reach for it. You clear that, you've earned supper." "Fair," said Gideon Vance, and that was the first bargain he and my mother ever struck. He worked till full dark. It was an ugly job, someone, and we all knew who someone, had dropped a dead dog down our good well in the night to spoil the water and speed us along. Vance hauled it up and dug out the fouled gravel and ran fresh water through till it came clear, and he did it without complaint and without once looking at my mother for thanks. When it was done, he washed at the trough and presented himself at the door, hat in hand, and my mother gave him beans and cornbread and the last of the coffee, and he ate at the bottom step of the porch because he would not presume to come inside a widow's house, and I sat near him because I was a lonesome boy who had just lost his father, and here was a man who smelled of horse and wood smoke, and did not look at me with pity. "You got a name, son?" he asked me. "Caleb," I said. "Caleb Cole. That was my pa's grave you saw, Daniel Cole." Vance was quiet a moment. "I'm sorry for it, Caleb," he said, and unlike Lyle Sard, he meant it. I could hear that he meant it. A boy oughtn't have to learn that hurt this young. He looked off at the dark shape of the cottonwood. "But you carry it. You'll find you can carry more than you think." I asked him if he had a family. It was a child's question, blunt and unkind, and I have regretted it across the years for the look it put on his face there and gone like a stone dropping into deep water. "I did," he said. "Once, a wife, a little girl about your sister's age if you had a sister." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Fever came through a long time ago in a town I don't ride past anymore. I buried them on a Tuesday." He said it plain, the way my mother had said we don't leave him. I've been moving ever since. Seems like every place I stop. I'm just there long enough to say goodbye to it. Gets to be a habit, the leaving. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. There are men who, having lost the one thing that held them in place, decide it is safer never to be held again, who turn their whole lives into one long farewell so that no parting can ever take them by surprise. Gideon Vance was such a man when he rode down our wash. He meant to fix our pump, sleep in our barn, and be gone before noon, one more goodbye in a life made of them. He did not leave at noon. He did not leave for a long time, and the reason was that the next morning Lyle Sard came back, and Gideon Vance was standing in our corral when he did. Sard came with 2 men and a different tone, the easy patience gone out of him, because a homestead that is supposed to be slowly starving is not supposed to have its well running clear, and its fence mended. Vance had set the cut wire right before breakfast, and a stranger working its corral. Sard sat his horse and looked Vance up and down. "Hooray you!" "Hand," said Vance. He didn't stop coiling the rope he was working. "Hooray you!" "I'm the man tells folks when their time's up at Coyote Bend." Sard's eyes went to my mother on the porch. "Hired help, Miss Cole. With what money? You can't keep a hand on. You can't keep this place at all. Save yourself the heartache and the work." He jerked his chin at Vance. "And you, drifter, you don't want to be standing on this ground when the end of the month comes. Mr. Mercer's not gentle about ground he considers his." Vance finished his coil and hung it on the rail unhurried. "Funny thing," he said. "Man keeps telling me whose ground this is, but the lady lives here and her husband's planted under that tree, and far as I can see the deed's hers, so it's hers." He looked up, and for the first time I saw the shutters of that quiet face come open a crack, and what was behind them was not soft at all. "You dropped a dog down a widow's well. That's a low thing to do to anybody. You do it again. You and me are going to have a conversation that don't involve any paper." It was not loud. He never raised his voice the whole time I knew him. But Lyle Sard, who smiled like a knife, did not smile then. He gathered his reins and said something about the end of the month and rode out, and I watched my mother watch Gideon Vance, and I think that was the moment, though neither of them would have admitted it then, that the leaving stopped. He stayed. Day to day, always, never a promise past the next morning. "I'll see you mended through the week," he'd say, and then, "I'll get that south fence solid before I go." And then, "Calf's due, I'll see her through." A man saying goodbye to our place so many days running that the goodbyes stacked up into a staying he never quite let himself name. And the place came back to life under his hands. He brought in the cattle that Mercer's men had scattered, working the burnt ladder draws on the buckskin from before light, bringing them down a few head at a time. He rebuilt the fence with the wire doubled and the posts set deep. He taught me to throw a loop, to read a horse, to whittle a passable horse out of a cottonwood limb with my father's old knife. And the first time I laughed that autumn, a real laugh, was at something Gideon Vance said dry as dust about a contrary milk cow, and I saw my mother stop in the doorway with the dish rag in her hand and look at us both with an expression I can only call hunger. Not for food, for the ordinary thing, for a man's voice in the yard and a boy laughing and the well running sweet. They were careful with each other, those two. My mother would not be beholden and Gideon would not presume, and so they met on the only safe ground there was, the work. They mended fence on opposite sides of the same line and talked across it about cattle and weather and what my father had meant the south field for. She fed him on the step, and he split her wood without being asked and stacked it higher than we'd need, as if the size of the woodpile could say the thing neither of them would. I'd catch them sometimes, her watching him gentle a frightened horse, him watching her bend over the ledger by lamplight with her brow furrowed at figures that wouldn't add, and each would look away the instant the other might catch them looking. One evening late in the month I found him at the cottonwood, standing at my father's grave with his hat off. I came up quiet and he didn't send me away. "Your pa built something good here, Caleb," he said. "It's worth holding." "Ma says we won't leave him," I scuffed the dirt. "Sard says we have to. He says paper always wins." Gideon Vance was quiet so long I thought he hadn't heard. Then he said, "Paper's only as honest as the man holding it, and I've known some dishonest paper in my time." He put his hat back on. "Your pa keep his records, receipts, letters, anything with figures." I told him about the ledger, and the strongbox under the bed where my father kept the deed and his important papers, and Gideon Vance got a look I hadn't seen on him. A sharpening, the look of a man who has remembered he used to be good at something. I learned later in pieces what that something was, That before the fever took his family, Gideon Vance had carried a deputy marshal's badge in another territory, that he'd read law in the evenings and served papers, and knew the difference between a debt and a swindle the way my mother knew her husband's hand. He'd buried all that with his wife and daughter and ridden off, and never meant to pick it up again. He picked it up again for us. It was my mother's decision to let him into it. I want that set down plain, because she was no helpless thing waiting to be saved, whatever the men in town said about her later. It was her ledger, her husband's strongbox, her land. Gideon Vance asked her leave before he touched a page of it, hat in hand on the bottom step as always, and laid out what he suspected. That no honest debt of $1,100 could exist with no trace in a careful man's records, and that Clell Mercer had likely forged or doctored that note the same way he'd forged his right to the water, and asked would she trust him to look. And my mother, who trusted almost no one that autumn, looked at the man who'd cleared her well and mended her fence and taught her son to laugh and asked for nothing, and she said, "Look, but we do it together at my table, and the deed doesn't leave my house." "Wouldn't have it any other way," said Gideon Vance. They sat up 3 nights at that table. I'd lie in the dark and hear the low back and forth of their voices, the rustle of paper, my mother reading my father's cramped figures aloud, Gideon's slow questions. And on the 3rd night the voices changed. They went sharp and quick, and then they stopped, and there was a silence, and then I heard my mother laugh, really laugh, the first time since the burial, a sound with tears in it. They'd found it. My father, it turned out, had borrowed once, years back, $300 from Clell Mercer to buy the seed bull that had built our little herd, and he had paid it back in full, on time, and he had been a careful enough man to get a signed receipt for it, which had slipped down behind the false bottom of the strongbox where it had sat forgotten. 300 paid. Mercer had taken that real, dead, settled debt, and his clerk had altered the figure to 1,100 and changed the date and burned my father's copy of the note, but not the receipt, because Mercer hadn't known the receipt existed. Paper always wins, Sard had said. My mother had the paper now, the honest kind. But Gideon Vance knew, the way an old lawman knows, that an honest receipt is only worth what a court will say it's worth, and that Clell Mercer owned the only court Vesper Crossing had, a bought magistrate, a hired foreman, and a valley too scared to cross him. A receipt alone wouldn't be enough. Mercer would simply produce his forged note, swear to it, and have his pet magistrate rule for him, and the law would do the stealing for him with a straight face. To beat a man like Mercer, you needed more than to be right. You needed to make being right impossible to bury, out loud, in front of the whole valley, with witnesses Mercer couldn't buy and couldn't shoot. So they made a plan, the widow and the drifter, at that lamplit table, and the end of the month came. They rode in on the last morning of the month, Clell Mercer himself this time, which I had never seen, a soft, heavy man on a fine horse who had grown rich enough that other men did his hard work, and Lyle Sard, and 6 riders behind them with rifles across their saddles. They came down our wash trail the way Sard had come the first morning, easy, certain, the way men ride to collect a thing already theirs. They came to drive a widow and her boy off their land. And they brought enough guns to do it. My mother was waiting on the porch in her black dress with my father's shotgun broke over her arm. I stood beside her because she would not send me inside this time. She said a man ought to see his home defended, and at 9 years old that word, man, set my spine straight even as my knees shook. And Gideon Vance stood in the dooryard at the bottom of the steps between us and the 8 riders, his rifle in the crook of his arm, not raised, just there. One man, afoot, in front of a woman and a child. "This is foolishness, Miss Cole," Mercer called. His voice was reasonable, almost kind, which was worse than Sard's knife smile. "Month's up. The note's called. My men are here to see you off peaceable, with your belongings and your boy and no debt at your back. Don't make it ugly in front of the child. Send your hired man aside and let's be done." "Read your note out loud, Mr. Mercer," my mother said. "Read the figure and the date so my son can hear what we're losing the place over." Mercer hesitated. A reasonable man does not hesitate over a reasonable thing. But there were others on the road that morning. That was the part of the plan that mattered. Gideon had ridden the valley 2 nights running, quiet, and brought out the ones who'd been too scared to come to a burial but weren't too scared to come see whether the law in Vesper Crossing was law or theft. Old Prout was there. The Hadley brothers. The widow Aldous, who Mercer had squeezed off her own quarter section the year before and who had her own grievance to air. The Methodist circuit preacher, who could not be bought because he owned nothing. A dozen of them, sitting their horses up on the ridge where Sard's men had sat the morning of the burial, watching. And Mercer, who needed his theft to look like law, could not simply have his men shoot a drifter and burn a widow out in front of a dozen witnesses and a preacher. That was the trap. That was the whole of it. Gideon had made it so that to take our land, Clell Mercer would first have to lie out loud, to people's faces, in daylight. The figure's 1,100, Mercer said, signed by your husband. For what? My mother said. What did Daniel borrow $1,100 to buy? Name it. That's not. He borrowed 300, she said, and her voice carried now up to the ridge, clear and hard as the spring water. 300 5 years back for the seed bull, and he paid it back the next autumn, every dollar, and your own clerk signed the receipt. She held it up, the yellowed paper, so the wind worried its corners the way it had worried Sard's forged note. 300, paid in full. I have your signature, Mr. Mercer, on the receipt. You changed a 3 to an 11 and burned the note and buried my husband in debt he didn't owe so you could have his water. Say I'm lying. Say it in front of these people. Say it to the preacher. The silence on that road was the loudest thing I ever heard. I watched Clell Mercer's reasonable face go through what a face goes through when a man realizes the lie he has gotten comfortable in has been pulled off him in front of his neighbors. He looked at the ridge. He looked at the preacher. He looked at Lyle Sard, and Sard's hand drifted toward his rifle, and that was the moment it could have all gone to blood, 8 guns and a frightened woman and a boy and a preacher on the hill. And Gideon Vance took 1 step forward and said, "Enough." He did not shout it. He said it the way you'd set down something heavy. Sard, you touch that gun and there's a dozen witnesses watch you do it, and I've served enough warrants to know how that ends for a hired man. Mercer will be in Mexico and you'll be on a rope. There's no good draw here for you. The lie's already out. You can't shoot it back in. He looked then at Mercer, and his voice didn't change, but something underneath it did, an old authority surfacing through the dust of years. Mr. Mercer, I rode law 8 years before I rode anything else. That receipt and that altered note together is a forgery and a fraud, and there's a circuit judge through Vesper Crossing come spring that you do not own. You can ride off this woman's land now and never set foot on it again, and maybe the valley lets the rest lie. Or you can push it, and these good people carry what they saw today to a court you can't buy, and you lose everything, the note, the water, your name. You're a businessman. You can add. Which is the better trade? I have thought about that moment all my life, the difference between Lyle Sard's smile and Gideon Vance's quiet. Sard believed paper always won because Sard believed the strong always won. Gideon Vance knew something truer and harder, that the strong win right up until the moment enough ordinary people are standing on a ridge watching, and then they don't. He'd spent the whole month not building a wall or buying a gun. He'd spent it making sure that, when the morning came, Clell Mercer would have to do his stealing in front of people who would remember. Mercer was a thief, but he was not a fool. A fool would have pushed it. He sat his fine horse a long moment, and the math went across his soft face, and he came up with the answer Gideon had handed him. He gathered his reins. "Burn the note, then," he said, to no one, to all of us, trying to make a ruin sound like a favor. "We'll call it square." And he turned that fine horse and rode back up our wash with his 6 riflemen trailing, and Lyle Sard last of all. And Sard looked back once at Gideon Vance with the look of a man memorizing a face. But they went, and they never came back to Coyote Bend. And within 2 years Clell Mercer had sold out of the valley and gone, his name too stained to do business with men who'd stood on that ridge. When the dust settled the second time, The road was full of our neighbors coming down the slope into the dooryard, Prout and the Hadleys and the widow Aldous and the preacher. And someone was laughing, and someone was crying, and someone put a kettle on. And for the first time since my father died, there were voices in our house and food on the table and no fear in any of it. My mother stood in the middle of it with the unfired shotgun still broke over her arm and tears running plain down her face now, in front of everyone, because there was nothing left to hide them from. And Gideon Vance stood off at the edge of it at the bottom of the steps where he always stood, hat in his hands, a man who had done what he came to do and was already, I could see it, reaching for the old habit, the leaving. One more place, one more goodbye, ride out before he could be held. My mother saw it too. She handed me the shotgun and she crossed the yard to him through all the neighbors, and she stopped in front of him, and the whole dooryard went quiet to watch, the way a valley watches when something is about to be decided. "You're fixing to go," she said. "It's what I do, ma'am." He turned his hat in his hands. "You're safe now. The place is yours and it'll stay yours. You don't need a drifter underfoot. I'll draw my wages in." "You never took a wage," she said. 3 months and you never once took a cent. You took your supper on my step like a stranger, and you split more wood than this place'll burn in 3 winters, and you stood in my yard this morning in front of 8 guns for a woman and a boy that aren't yours." Her voice shook and she let it. "Why?" I watched Gideon Vance try to say it was nothing, the way he'd said his wife and child plain, the way he kept everything plain so it couldn't reach him. And I watched it not work. He looked at her and at me, and at the cottonwood with my father under it, and at the spring running sweet, and at the woodpile he'd built 3 winters high, and I think for the first time in all the long years of his leaving, the man let himself look at a place without already saying goodbye to it. "Because," he said, and his voice wasn't plain anymore, "I've been telling myself for 10 years that the safe thing was to never stop anywhere, that if I never had a home I could never lose one, and then I rode down your wash for a drink of water." He stopped, started again. "And I found a woman too proud to be pitied and a boy who reminded me how to laugh and a piece of ground worth standing in front of guns for. And I have spent 3 months pretending every day was the day I'd leave, and ma'am, Marin, I am so tired of leaving. I have said goodbye to every place I ever set my foot. I don't want to say it to this one." My mother reached out and took his hat out of his hand so he'd have nothing to turn, and she held both his hands in both of hers, there in the dooryard with the whole valley watching, and she said, "Then don't. Stay. Not as a hand. Stay." I will not pretend to remember every word after that. Because I was 9 and a neighbor had pressed a slab of cornbread into my hand, and the preacher was beaming, and the widow Aldous was openly weeping into her shawl, and a great noise of gladness went up in our dooryard that drowned the rest. But I remember that Gideon Vance did not say goodbye to Coyote Bend that day. I remember that he slept in the barn that night out of propriety, the same as the first night, and that he was still there in the morning, and the morning after, and that come, the spring, the circuit preacher married my mother and Gideon Vance under the cottonwood within sight of my father's grave, because my mother said Daniel would have wanted the man who saved his family standing on his ground, and I believe she was right. Whatever there was between them after that was theirs, quiet and earned and kept behind a closed door, and a son does not speak of his mother that way. I'll only say that I never again heard that broken hinge sound through the wall, and that I heard, instead, low talk and easy laughter, and that a house I had thought was ending became the warmest one I ever lived in. I am an old man now. Older than Gideon Vance was when he rode down our wash, older than my father ever got to be. Coyote Bend is still ours. My own grandsons run the cattle on the burnt ladder draws now, and the spring still comes up clear and cold out of the rocks, and no Mercer ever took a foot of it. Gideon Vance worked that ground 40 years and called me son, and taught me everything I know about cattle and horses, and the difference between being strong and being right. He never had much to say. He didn't need much. He'd built his whole self once to be a man who left, and he spent the rest of his life proving to himself, one ordinary day at a time that he could stay. He and my mother lie up under the cottonwood now, side by side, and my father on the other side of them, the three of them in a row in the shade, and I tend all three graves the same. I think about that often, that my father's death is what brought Gideon Vance down our wash, and that the worst morning of my boyhood, the morning we buried Daniel Cole with three of Mercer's men waiting on the ridge, was also, though none of us could have known it, the morning our real family began. There's a thing folks get wrong about a farewell. They think it's an ending, but the truth is a man can spend his whole life saying goodbye to one place after another, the way Gideon Vance did, and never once arrive anywhere. And then one day he says it for the last time, the last goodbye, goodbye to the leaving itself, and that turns out to be the only door that ever opened onto a home. He stood in our dooryard one morning when I was 9 and said, "Enough," to 8 armed men, and they rode off and never came back. But the word I think he was really saying, that morning and every morning after, was to himself, "Enough running, enough goodbyes." He set down the heavy thing he'd carried for 10 years, and he stayed and he held us and we held him, right to the end. And that more than any deed or any spring is what he left us, not a farewell, the end of one.